Hello, everyone. This is Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, with me, the awesome, the indomitable, on the job um, journalist, Aaron Matei, journalist of The Nation and The Gray Zone, and has just wrote an awesome article in Real Clear Politics. And part of the reason why I'm glad to have him on the show. Please welcome journalist Aaron Matei.
Thanks for having me. As I understand it, you're the one who gave me the nickname the Buzzsaw, which
I am the one that gave you the nickname Buzzsaw because I think it was maybe the second or third time I saw you eat somebody alive on the Central Russia Gate. I saw you in all of these like back and forth these battles, and you were like eating people alive on this particular issue. I was like, this guy's Buzzsaw. He's killing them.
Well, it's not hard because you're basically arguing with people who are acting like teenagers who still believe in Santa Claus. So, but anyway, I appreciate you giving me the nickname. I've just seen on social media and stuff. Many people call me that, and even some friends of mine have been teasing me by calling me that as well. So,
that's funny. That's good teasing, man.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it.
There are worse ways to be teased. Trust me. So I am so glad to have you on the show with everything that's breaking with the whole Russiagate stuff. And it seems like the story continues to fall apart. Solomon at The Hill has been writing really good stories on this, but you probably more than anybody else that I am aware of have been on it, particularly at your post on Real News Network. But even now, still. So I want to start just at the basics of the beginning of this and why you were skeptical of this in the initial breaking of this. What was the thing that initially tipped your hat off to, okay, maybe there's something wrong with this story?
In the summer of 2016, early July is when there was a major article in The Atlantic called something like, "Is Trump Putin's Puppet?" And it was by Franklin Foer. And then I saw increasingly Democrats use that in their political messaging as part of the campaign. That coincided with this firm CrowdStrike coming out and accusing Russia of being behind the theft of Democratic Party emails. The CrowdStrike thing happened in mid-June 2016. And, I saw increasingly it being an attack line by Democrats to go after Trump for having these Russian ties. But yet, when I would look at what they were adducing to substantiate their claims, I just didn't see much evidence. And, in general, I'm not comfortable with sort of Cold War chauvinism, and this notion to begin with that anything associated with Russia is somehow nefarious. And unfortunately, I saw many people going along with this. It became sort of fashionable, even in progressive circles, to, go after Trump on the basis of having these really ill-defined Russia ties. I used to work at the show Democracy Now! I was there for 10 years.
Yep.
And even then, in the summer of 2016, were pushing this. They had on Kurt Eichenwald, who to me is a discredited journalist who also was an early peddler of this stuff. So just from a journalistic point of view, I just thought that it raised red flags. And then from a political point of view, I was uncomfortable with it too, because I thought it was promoting a kind of, Cold War chauvinism and jingoism. And I also just thought it was not the right way to go after Donald Trump. The way to go after Donald Trump was to, take him on the issues. But partly why Russiagate has persisted for so long is because the Democrats who played such a big role in generating Russiagate, the corporate Democrats, liberals, have been so resistant to taking on the issues. So, that is, I think, what fueled my initial skepticism. And that only grew as this thing got increasingly bigger, and it was increasingly obvious that there was no evidence to support so many of the core assertions. But yet still it grew into a bigger thing, and it became, it sort of died down a little bit now. But as we know, for over 2 years, it sort of was the core of the so-called resistance to Trump, which I thought was just a political disaster on top of being so journalistically reckless.
It's funny. When this first started, my thought was all of these guys have a dog in this hunt. The Democratic Party was looking for some way to absolve themselves of blame for Hillary Clinton losing to a reality show host.
Yep.
The media circles hated his guts, and I think some of them might have thought that they were fighting the good fight. You know, they were doing God's work by going against an ogre. But in doing so, kind of getting rid of all notion of journalistic integrity and success. I mean, it got obscene. I remember at one point, like news stories would come out and people would be like, "We got him," and you find out like a day later, okay, we don't have him. And it was always in one direction. You know, it was always something that we got Trump doing that we finally found ties with Russia, and oh my God, we didn't find ties with Russia. It was obscene. It was absolutely obscene. So let me ask you this: based on what we know now, what are some of the problems in the story? Because Mueller came out with his report. It was supposed to be a bombshell report. And the report essentially said that Democrats got everything they wanted with the exception of Trump, and there's no collusion. But there are problems with the report. And you made that known in the Real Clear Politics article. And that was even before the court case came out. So before we get to the court thing that just came out recently that broke, what were some of the issues and the flaws with the Mueller report that we know of now?
Well, let's look broadly at what Russiagate is. So we have, I think, three core aspects. There's the allegation that Russia engaged in Mueller's words, a sweeping and systematic interference campaign. There's the suspicion that the Trump campaign conspired with it, so collusion. And then there's the question of whether Trump obstructed justice in trying to impede the investigation into both the first two things. So let's take the first thing I mentioned, which is the allegation of Russian government interference. So Mueller says in his report that there was a sweeping and systematic Russian government interference campaign. There's two main problems with this, that's because there are two main aspects, Mueller says, of this alleged Russian interference operation. He says that there was the hacking and leaking of Democratic Party emails, and there was a social media campaign. So let's take the first one. When it comes to the hacking and leaking of Democratic Party emails, look, I'm not one of these people that rules out the possibility that Russia stole the emails or somebody inside Russia stole the emails. You know, there are theories that it was an insider.
Yeah.
People like Bill Binney, who is a highly esteemed former technical director of the NSA, he's shown evidence that shows that some of the data that from the DNC was transferred via a thumb drive.
Yeah, it was like a leak as opposed to a hack.
Yeah, and I think that needs to be taken seriously. I don't think you can say all that is conclusive because any number of scenarios are possible. Like that data could have been transferred after it was hacked.
Yeah.
But I think Binney needs to be listened to, and he's been totally silenced when it comes to mainstream discussion and even some progressive discussion of this topic as well, which I think is unfortunate. And we also don't know, and Mueller's report itself in laying out his case for Russia hacking and leaking Democratic Party emails, there are instances, and I point this out in my latest piece for Real Clear Investigations, that Mueller uses qualified tentative language to talk about the core act of stealing the emails. He's describing the moment where he's suggesting that the GRU officers stole Democratic Party emails, but he says that during these sessions, GRU officers, quote, appear to have stolen thousands of emails. So he's qualifying his assertion there. He's not saying they stole the emails during this period. He's saying that they appear to have stolen them. Which says to me that he's engaged in some qualified language to cover up for the fact that he doesn't actually have specific knowledge. And he also acknowledges straight up that he doesn't know how the emails made their way to WikiLeaks.
Yeah.
He suggested in his indictment, and he suggests in the report.
There's also another weird aspect to that I continuously bring up that seems to be the glaring that nobody really cares about. If you really was trying to get to the bottom of this, wouldn't you go to the person who supposedly is at the center of it, Julian Assange? I mean, Assange was literally sitting in the embassy for 7 years. He wasn't going anywhere. He was right there. It looks like it's the weirdest loop or the weirdest omission in the report. There are a few omissions, but that just seems to be a glaring one that people just kind of roll past.
I totally agree, and I point that I flagged that in my piece. But just to finish the previous thought, so
Yeah.
Mueller suggests that he doesn't outright say, because he can't say it because it's probably false, that that Guccifer 2.0, who he alleges is a Russian intelligence cutout, that Guccifer 2.0 transferred the emails to WikiLeaks, which makes no sense in terms of even its own internal logic. Because for that to be true, that would have meant that Julian Assange would have announced that he had those emails before he even communicated with Guccifer 2.0 and before he received files from Guccifer 2.0. That's according to Mueller's own timeline, and you can read about it in my piece. And yes, as you point out, Mueller did not speak to Julian Assange, which is a totally glaring omission. Assange has made overtures to the U.S. government, to Congress to speak. He has said the Russian government was not his source, but yet Mueller apparently had no interest in speaking to him, and that is a very glaring omission, to say the least.
You named three things. You said that, based on the case, that there were certain logic associated with the Russia thing, and you mentioned that there were problems associated with it in and of itself, meaning essentially what we know now. What's the judge? A judge recently came out like, look, there are two questions on this.
Right. So let me finish. So Mueller says that there are two principal aspects of this Russian interference operation: the hacking and leaking, which I just addressed, and now let's move on to the second one, okay, which is this social media campaign run by the Internet Research Agency that was supposedly aimed to sow discord in U.S. society.
Right.
Now, first of all, there's one problem with this narrative, which is that if you look at all these ads and social media posts that the Internet Research Agency put out, you'll see clearly that they're all basically juvenile clickbait and almost entirely unrelated to the actual election. There's Jesus memes, there's
masturbation memes.
There's masturbation meme. It's silly clickbait in an obvious attempt to basically attract followers. And then what clickbait firms do is they leverage their followers to sell ads to people, and that's what the Internet Research Agency did. But somehow this gets spun into a sweeping and sophisticated Russian social media operation, which is just a joke on itself. Another glaring hole is the fact, and I point this out in the piece, that although Mueller says that this social media operation was a principal component of the Russian government's sweeping and systematic interference campaign, he never actually asserts that this troll farm is connected to the Russian government and conducted its juvenile clickbait in cooperation with the Russian government. And that's why he was forced to just admit at his closing press conference that this is a private Russian entity. It's basically a private company. And a judge in the case where that issue is being brought, because Mueller indicted this troll farm, the troll farm, which is controlled by a firm called Concord, and Concord is challenging this case in court. Concord challenged Mueller for doing this, for saying that you accused us of being a part of a Russian government operation, even though in your indictment and in the details of your report, you never actually show and you never allege a concrete link between us and the Russian government. And this judge this order just came out. The judge has rebuked Mueller for doing that, saying that that was an infringement of Concord's rights, basically, that they were impugned falsely, which is a huge rebuke, and it raises a question. So if Mueller is being woefully disingenuous about the second element of what he calls the Russian government's sweeping and systematic interference campaign, then what else is he being disingenuous about?
One of the questions that I really hope get asked when Mueller is sitting before Congress, Mueller tried to avoid this like the plague. But, did you ever consider that it wasn't the Russians? Like, when you first looked at this case and you first started this, you were thinking about the way you were framing your report and the way you were looking at this, did at any point in your thought process, did you look at this in any way that did not include the Russian government being involved? And the reason I ask this is because the troll farm thing is a really good point to that. It's a private company. and a private company that was existed before the election. And during the election, I do a channel. I know for myself that when an election is taking place, you kind of go along with whatever is the prevailing notion. If it's an election, you put out memes to deal with the election because that allows people to click, because that's the way you make your dollars. Like, if you're looking at this in a way that doesn't include or doesn't force this Russian narrative, it makes all the sense in the world that a private company that's a clickbait farm would do what's in his best interest for clicks. I just find it amazing that that's not like,
well, look,
nobody entertains that.
I mean, as I said, even if this thing was run by the Russian government, if it was, then the Russian government would be extremely embarrassed that this was their sophisticated interference operation. Because again, the whole thing was a joke. You have this troll farm putting out juvenile clickbait with Buff Bernie memes and Jesus arm wrestling and masturbation ads. It has nothing to do with the election. Most of the ads ran after the election. In the key swing states, the three key swing states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and I think Ohio, they were the ads were seen less than 1,000 times. And even if they saw them, even if anybody actually saw them, the notion that this could sway a single vote, ads that are written in broken English and are not even about the election, is just ridiculous. But yet, the Russiagate narrative wants us to believe that this was some sophisticated Russian operation trying to sow discord and inflame people. And the whole thing shows such contempt for average Americans and their concerns. And, this notion that people are so malleable that they could be swayed by juvenile Russian clickbait, or that people could go out to protest police brutality because they saw it from a Russian social media ad.
Not because they were bothered by the fact somebody got shot. Yeah.
I mean, it's ludicrous, but yet this is a core claim, and it speaks to how Russiagate survives. It's an act of projection. It's a refusal on the part of domestic elites to grapple with the country's own problems, with their own failures, and to distract people from the issues that really impact their lives, and to blame everything on Russia.
What are you looking forward to in this hearing coming up with Mueller? Like, what questions because I know Democrats are not going to ask these questions, but if you were a Republican and you were sitting on the bench looking at Mueller and you got the opportunity to ask him questions, what would those questions be? That's the first thing. But the one more question, Misfit, Joseph Misfit. Joseph Misfit turns out that he's an asset, a CIA asset, or he was working with the intelligence services?
No.
Mueller.
No. That's the speculation.
Okay.
And just to explain this for anybody who's not familiar with it, Joseph Mifsud is basically the predicate for the entire Russia probe, officially at least. I'm not sure if he actually is what sparked the Russia probe, but according to the official FBI narrative, and we have to take it at face value for now, or at least take it seriously for now, that Joseph Mifsud, who is this mysterious professor, told a campaign volunteer named George Papadopoulos that the Russians might have damaging information on Hillary Clinton and they might release it. And so because when the FBI found out that Mifsud had told Papadopoulos this, or allegedly told Papadopoulos this, the FBI says that led it to open up an investigation of the Trump campaign, to open up the initial Trump-Russia investigation at the very end of July 2016. I personally doubt that story, but even if it's true, it's an incredibly thin predicate.
Yeah.
And because it's like you're opening up a counterintelligence investigation of a sitting presidential campaign based on the fact that some low-level unpaid volunteer was told some vague information about the Russians might having something. So you're going to investigate the whole campaign for that. It's very sketchy, and I personally don't believe it. But that's what they want us to believe. And now there's speculation, and Mueller tried hard, and people have tried hard to paint Mifsud as a possible Russian agent, but they never directly accuse him of that because they have no evidence that he's a Russian agent. And there's also speculation that, in fact, Mifsud was working with Western intelligence agencies. Mifsud certainly has connections to Western intelligence. He worked at a campus which has sort of been a training ground for Western officials and Western spies, but we don't have any confirmation yet. Mifsud has pretty much gone dark for a long time. So we don't know, right? It's all speculation. it's certainly sketchy, and certainly, one thing that is interesting, I'll say this: uh, Mueller interviewed Miss Sood in early 2017, and Mueller even says in his report that Miss Sood lied to him, but yet Mueller never indicted Miss Sood, but which is all the more puzzling because Mueller indicted George Papadopoulos for lying. That is one question that I think Mueller should be asked, and Mueller should also be asked. You suggested that Miss Sood might be a Russian agent, but you didn't outright say it, and you also suggested many other people were Russian agents, but you didn't outright say it. Why did you omit the fact when you were talking about Miss Sood that he has Western ties? Why did you omit the fact that Konstantin Kilimnik, who Mueller also said is tied to Russian intelligence? Why did you omit the fact that he was a State Department informant at the time when he was supposedly also tied to Russian intelligence? Kilimnik is Manafort's business associate, and he's a big part of the conspiracy theory as well because Manafort shared with him some polling data, and that got spun into this crazy theory that like Manafort was sharing some secretive data, which then Kilimnik passed on to the Russians for the Russians to specifically target their U.S. audiences with in their sophisticated social media campaign that, of course, was not connected to the Russian government. So even that wild theory didn't even make sense internally. Another question asked Mueller on this front is, in fact, there's been all this talk about Trump people interacting with Russian intermediaries and Russian agents. You should ask Mueller straight up: did the Trump campaign or anybody in the Trump orbit interact with a single person who was actually acting on the Russian government's behalf, aside from two people, the Russian ambassador, because that's what happens during a campaign. You meet with ambassadors, and that happened, and a Kremlin assistant who Michael Cohen spoke to when Michael Cohen wanted to get help about the Trump Tower in Moscow. The Kremlin assistant told Michael Cohen, sorry, we can't help you. So those are the only two people that I can think of from the report where Mueller actually says clearly that these people were acting on the Russian government's behalf who spoke to the Trump campaign. Otherwise, there's all these other people who like either are Russian or know somebody who's Russian, who knows somebody or who claims to know somebody who's Russian. But Mueller doesn't assert that there are any Russian agents. So I'd like for Mueller to specify, were there any actual Russian agents interacting with anybody from the Trump campaign? The answer is no. But yet, because so much of the people in power and in media decided on this conspiracy theory, all this has gotten obscured into basically turning any interaction with someone who has a Russian passport or who claims to know someone with a Russian passport into some sort of nefarious or suspect interaction. The last thing I'll say on this is, the biggest example is the Trump Tower meeting between John Jr., Jared Kushner, Manafort, and a group of Russians. It's seen as damning. It's seen as the fact that the Trump campaign accepted the Kremlin's offer of assistance when Donald Trump Jr. said, if that's what you say it is, I loved it, because he was told that the Russian government has compromising information on Hillary Clinton. Well, nobody, including Mueller, acknowledges the fact that that offer was not transmitted by a Russian or on the Russian government's behalf. It was transmitted by a music publicist, a British music publicist named Rob Goldstone, who was working for a Russian oligarch. And Goldstone, by his own account, says he was lying. It was a lie. Like he made it up. But that's just one more example of something that gets ignored in order to paint a conspiracy theory narrative. But if you look at every single thing individually, and this is why it's hard. I mean, I've had the time, or at least I've decided to have the time to do all this, reading that is required to go through all the crap to find the actual facts. But people don't have the time for that. And so, that's why those responsible for giving people accurate information in media and also in politics as well have been derelict in failing to apply journalistic standards to all this wild stuff. Because when it comes down to it, it's a disingenuous conspiracy theory that relies on obscuring the available facts and simply ignoring all the countervailing ones.
Just so we're clear, recently Solomon broke this news in the Hill where he was in contact with before, beyond that point, not who he was in contact with, but he kind of makes this point that they found, I guess they were using the Freedom of Information Act, and they were able to find information showing that the Steele document that they knew that Steele was essentially a political actor and that Steele was trying to get that information out just before the election. Now, that's a bombshell because that gets across this notion that A, it's illegal. I mean, you have a FISA warrant. You kind of have to tell the FISA court judge that this guy's a political actor, and you know this guy's a political actor, and the information is out. Does that not indicate that there's a little bit something more? What do you think the reasons for this? Like, do you think that this is really to cover up spying prior to this investigation, meaning the Obama administration was spying on the Trump administration in this case, and the Russia claim was used as a way to cover this up? Or do you think this was just purely a politicized thing after the fact to cover up losing the election?
Well, I don't think the Obama administration, see, I don't have proof that Obama was involved in all this. I mean, I think Obama made some questionable decisions, but I mean,
I don't mean to insinuate that, by the way. I didn't mean it just in those terms. I just meant that administration, there was some level of spying, or there were people who were in
the FBI. The FBI under Obama's watch did spy on figures in the Trump campaign. I don't think they wiretapped Donald Trump's phones, as has been suggested. I don't think it went that far. But look, yes, the FBI, you sent an informant to speak to Carter Page, and they also got a FISA warrant on Carter and also George Papadopoulos as well. He also had a
honeypot
with him. Yeah. And they got a FISA warrant on Carter Page. And if you get a FISA warrant on Carter Page, then you do have a possible window into the Trump campaign, because and this is what's extraordinary. If the FISA warrant on Page has since been declassified, and it says in there that the FBI believes that Carter Page is coordinating between Moscow, the Kremlin, and the Trump campaign, and their top source for that is the Steele dossier.
That's astonishing.
This piece of garbage alleging a high-level conspiracy and blackmail relationship between Trump and the Kremlin. That's
my point, though. The fact that they knew in advance that Steele was trying to get this out into the public itself, I mean, that gets somewhat problematic. This is kind of why I asked this larger question of, what do you think the entire point of this?
So what I think was going on is first of all, and just to finish the Steele piece. So basically, what's extraordinary also about that FISA application by the FBI is not only that they cited this Steele dossier, they sort of concealed the fact that it was paid for by the Democratic Party, by Trump's opponent. Now, they have a vague reference about this, this source might have a political interest in harming Trump, but they don't outright specify the source was a paid contractor for the Democratic Party, Trump's opponent. So they hid that fact from the surveillance court, which is just extraordinary. So what I think was going on, I think, what I know is this: Trump's candidacy spooked aspects of the U.S. elite. Not because the U.S. elite is woke, not because the U.S. elite is offended by Trump's racism or his misogyny, but because Trump was doing a few things. First of all, on the campaign trail, he was speaking out against foreign intervention, and he was talking about withdrawing the U.S. from proxy wars in Syria, and he was talking about better relations with Russia. And that is like sacrilege if you're in the bipartisan foreign policy establishment. And that's why, in the summer of 2016, you had all these people from the Republican Party as well coming out strongly against Trump's candidacy. Now, I personally think Trump was not sincere in his message, as I think his policies show. He's escalated foreign intervention. His administration has been more hawkish towards Russia. But nonetheless, I think he was tapped into a very real sort of anti-interventionist sentiment, and that was in the populace that other politicians like Hillary Clinton have ignored, and partly because they're complicit in the policies that people are rebelling against. So I think that freaked out people like John Brennan and Jim Comey and other members of the national security state. And they acted, I think, overzealously in response to that. And I think that, ever since then, that has been a sort of that has continued. And in fact, Andrew McCabe admitted that this is in a crazy admission that in the spring of 2017, the FBI opened up a new counterintelligence investigation of Trump as a possible Russian agent, not based on having any evidence of any kind of secret contacts or anything, but because Trump wasn't criticized Vladimir Putin in public and Trump was, saying nice things about Russia. That was basically deemed to be suspicious enough to open up a counterintelligence investigation of the president. Like,
Yeah,
it speaks to the sort of paranoid Cold War mindset the national security state elites operate in, and the reason they operate in that mindset is because that mindset justifies their existence.
Yeah,
The national security state exists to warmonger, to drum up tensions with Russia, because that in turn justifies weapons contracts. It justifies, aggressive military deployments around the world. It justifies the salaries for people in think tanks and inside the intelligence agencies who are tasked with producing all these dire warnings about foreign threats, which is a very old racket going back forever. I mean, American history diverges in who is chosen to be the official enemy to justify the existence of the military-industrial complex. And right now, Russia is has been recast in that role after taking a back seat for a while. I mean, we remember when Obama mocked Mitt Romney for saying that Russia was our biggest geopolitical threat. That and the Democrats, all celebrated when Obama did that. Now they've totally walked that back because now it's politically convenient, and politically convenient for them as well, because they have an interest too in this, because they need, as you said, they need to blame Russia for their own failures in losing to Donald Trump.
one of my subscribers, they have a question. This is a super chat. This is Bella Lou. Yeah, Bella Lou. Ask Aaron about the Isikoff Seth Rich conspiracy debunking that was published yesterday in HuffPost. There was a lot of Russia claims in the second podcast. I don't know if you saw that.
I haven't seen that yet. So Isikoff says that the Seth Rich hoax claims originated with a Russian intelligence agency, the SVR.
Oh, wow.
I haven't read his article or heard his podcast yet. I'll just say I find it hard to believe. Philip Bump of the Washington Post has an article, which I also haven't read, but what I was told is that Philip Bump shows that the Seth Rich claims were, well predate whenever Isikoff says that the SVR, Russian intelligence, made them. So, and in general, I'll just say that what I hope Russiagate has taught everybody is that be skeptical of explosive claims like this, because so many of them have been discredited and have been retracted. And, Michael Isikoff is somebody who I personally like. I think he's a very accomplished reporter, and I think he's a nice guy. I've interviewed him many times, but, look, he helped push the Steele dossier initially, and which turned out to be a total farce. So and he since, I think, had at least the integrity to acknowledge that the Steele dossier is discredited, whereas others are still clinging to it, and probably. But still, the point is that is a part of his record as well, and the overall record of Russiagate as well is a series, and in fact, an unprecedented, at least that I can think of in my lifetime, an unprecedented series of failures and debunked or retracted stories. So I would just advise skepticism in this case, and when I get the time to read it, I will, and maybe I'll say something more if I have anything valuable to say.
And the problem is the moment that you get this kind of narrative going, the perspective is set.
Yeah.
It's almost like, almost in a psychology way, people have a hard time backing away from the first bit of information that they received on something. Yeah. And in this case, it's such a large scale operation of sorts that put this into people's heads. So whether it's true or not, it becomes less important. And it even becomes one of those things where even when new information comes, you can't really see it. It's like nothing breaks the narrative because the narrative was already set that Trump was colluding with Russia in some way. And so that's the way it is. Even when Mueller comes out and says it's not true, people are still digging the ditch. It's amazing.
and this is why it's so cynical. And then I have to wrap pretty soon.
The
So,
last question. That was the last
but,
question.
but the reason why it's so cynical and unfortunate is because part of the reason why it persists is because the RussiaGate narrative, due to its prevalence and how incessant it's become synonymous with opposing Trump.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's taken advantage of all those people who are rightfully upset by Trump's victory and want to see him out of office. And it's been presented to us as the dominant way to resist Trump. And anything that pushes the narrative is automatically seen as being hurtful to Trump.
Yeah.
But what people don't realize is that if the evidence for it is baseless, then all that what we're actually doing in pushing it is ultimately helping Trump because we're channeling energy into a conspiracy theory instead of focusing on challenging Trump's actual policies, which is what RussiaGate did for 2 years. I mean, just look at what Democrats and outlets like MSNBC and CNN focused on, and how the abundance of energy and time that was spent on RussiaGate could have been spent on Trump's actual policies. You look at the fact that there were bigger protests over the firing of Jeff Sessions because people thought that would be a threat to Robert Mueller. Bigger protests amongst liberals over that than about Trump's tax cuts or
Yeah.
about Trump's pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal or Trump pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords. So just look where liberal energies have been placed, which is in itself a huge gift to Trump. And it hands Trump another gift when ultimately the conspiracy theory collapsed, as inevitably it would. And now Trump is handed a further victory of exoneration. He can claim, this collusion thing that they talked about for 2 years. Well, there's no collusion, So it's given him so many gifts, and but unfortunately, people don't have the time to go through all the information and have to rely on what Rachel Maddow or the New York Times or the Washington Post or even many progressive outlets that drank the Kool-Aid, and there are many of them.
Yeah.
People who rely on them, they don't have the awareness and just enough information to know that what they're buying into actually ultimately is not only baseless, but is actually helping Trump. So that's why it's been so cynical, because it took advantage of those people who were very justifiably upset by Trump's victory and very much wanting to see him go.
God, one last question. You're talking about TYT on that one because I saw you going debating Cenk Uygur. You were
I'm
making
talking about everybody. I'm talking about TYT. I'm talking about The Intercept, pretty much with the exception of Glenn Greenwald and sometimes Jeremy Scahill. I'm talking about my former colleagues at Democracy Now, who I'm talking about some of my colleagues at The Nation magazine. I'm talking about Mother Jones.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
you know,
definitely.
everybody. Even at the Real News, there was some difficulty for me there as well in pushing back on this. So it's just like it became so overpowering, and it persuaded way too many smart people into I think losing their critical faculties on this one. And
Wait,
I'm hoping at least that the collapse of the conspiracy theory now will put an end to it.
you had conflict at Real News Network on this particular issue? I mean, I know they started going the Russiagate direction when you left. I didn't realize that there was conflict while you were there.
Well, I mean, look, it's tricky, and I don't want to get too much into it. I'll just say I had difficulties at times doing the kind of work, kind of skeptical journalism I was doing on Russiagate. At
I
the same
see.
time, I'm grateful I was given many opportunities to do it, and that's why I'm glad that we stood apart for a while. Like my Luke Harding interview reached a lot of people, and I think helped change some minds.
Yeah.
People were very grateful for that one, and so I'm grateful for the chance I got, but it wasn't always easy doing it there, and I think that I'm not there anymore, but I think that a huge opportunity was wasted because there was a time when we were standing apart, and that stopped happening.
Dude, thank you so much for coming on to the show. Is there anything you want to say before we close?
Well, listen, I appreciate you. I know we've been trying to do this for a while, so I appreciate your patience, and I'm glad we finally made it happen. I thank you for your support of my work. I know you've been highlighting it and boosting it. I'm just very grateful for that. And I also just think it's so important for like Russiagate has taught us many things, including the importance of independent media and outlets like yours who are brave enough to push back against the prevailing narratives, and to and I just hope everybody supports the kind of work you're doing, and all of us just stand in solidarity with people who are trying to stay true to what the principles of independent media are. And I thank you for what you're doing.
Very cool, man. Well, you do good work. That's why I cover it. So that's what it boils down to. All right, guys, I'm going to end this here. If you guys enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support through PayPal or Patreon.
Oh, let me say one more thing, actually.
Go for it.
I'm about to launch a new show with The Gray Zone, with Max Blumenthal at The Gray Zone. It's called Pushback, and we're launching it very soon. And I'll be getting back to doing the kind of work I was doing at The Real News. So I hope people will tune into that when it comes out. It will be available through The Gray Zone.
If you send me the link, I'll drop it at the bottom.
I will.
Very cool. Thanks all.
Thank you.
And we are